Queen was in Balmoral because she wasn't well enough to come to London. We ended up flying to Balmoral, and it was a very stormy day. There was various possibilities the flight wouldn't be able to land.
Liz Truss, recently elected head of the Conservative Party, went to see the Queen.
The rain was driving as we drove in the car towards Balmoral, and Her late Majesty was, clearly very frail, but at the same time, incredibly resolute.
The Queen asked her to form a new government as Prime Minister.
It was a huge honor, and the whole experience, but particularly that day, was a pinch me moment of thinking, am I really here? Is this really happening? Yeah.
As Liz Truss drove away, she could not know that 2 days later, the Queen would pass away here at Balmoral, and that after only 44 days in office, she herself would resign, becoming the shortest-lived Prime Minister in British history. It's a very British tale of blundering, backstabbing, and betrayals.
I'm honoured to take my place as Prime Minister in this House and to take on responsibility at a vital time for our country. I am determined to deliver...
She took office after COVID, after Brexit, after the onset of the war in Ukraine, and during an energy crisis.
I looked across the Atlantic at the United States, and I could see policies that were working, such as tax cuts, deregulation, fracking, and I was frustrated that we weren't able to implement those policies in Britain. So I ran on a ticket of change, of removing Britain truly from the European orbit. I mean, we'd left the European Union, but we still had, and we still have, all the European laws on our statute books.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer. Yeah!
There is nothing new about the Tory fantasy of trickle-down economics.
The battle lines were quickly drawn.
Well, there's nothing new about a Labour leader who is calling for more tax rises. Tax and spend.
In my opinion, our economy is stagnating because taxes are too high, the government's too big, there's too much regulation, it's expensive to build anything, it's expensive to get energy, it's not surprising, it's uncompetitive to run a business.
I'm afraid to say the right honourable gentleman doesn't understand aspiration, he doesn't understand opportunity, he doesn't understand that people want to keep more of their own money. What I'm about is about reducing taxes, getting our economy growing, getting investment, getting new jobs for people right across the country.
These are absolutely core beliefs of those who support free market policies and supply-side policies, but that was not widely shared. It wasn't even widely shared within the Conservative Parliamentary Party, let alone the wider economic establishment and media establishments.
This establishment is dubbed by some American politicians the administrative state, or the swamp. In Britain, they call it the Blob.
I think the Blob describes wider than just the government. It's a groupthink shared by senior media executives, senior corporate executives, civil servants. Wouldn't it be better if experts and technocrats were running everything? That's a whole shared belief system. Big spending, big government, big taxes, big immigration.
The logical conclusion is that the government, the state, can grow an economy faster than the free market, faster than enterprise. And essentially that was the view of the Soviet Union. And we examined that proposition and it failed dismally. So one has to have some faith and belief in the free market, in the enterprise culture.
While Truss and Kwarteng embraced free market economics, the Treasury Department did not, making them, as Truss and Kwarteng saw it, part of the blob.
We were trying to rejig the Treasury to be more focused on growth. In order to do that, we needed to have fresh leadership in the Treasury.
The Treasury's job is to set guidance, publish guidance, draw accounting officers' attention to it, and then expect them to perform against it.
So they fired Sir Tom Scholar, the Treasury's senior civil servant, shocking the political class.
When Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng pushed back against the Treasury orthodoxy, when they pushed back against the sort of so-called blob or deep state, or call it what you will, they're pushing back against expertise and experience and know-how.
It's not the British way with a change of government to change the senior civil servants. The idea is the independence, the political impartiality of civil servants.
Even if the impartial civil service worked in the past, it's not working now to be able to deliver conservative policies. The civil service has differing views, such as the support of Black Lives Matter, support of the extreme trans agenda, support of eco-extremism.
Beyond the civil service, there are hundreds of independent agencies which are not accountable to the Prime Minister.
There's also the Bank of England, run by the Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, another person who subscribes to the Treasury orthodoxy.
What's called the blob is hard to define.
But it's kind of like a mass that keeps getting bigger and bigger.
The blob absorbs everything in its path, constantly expanding.
I now call the Chancellor of the Exchequer to make a statement. Chancellor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Kwasi Kwarteng presented their ambitious growth plan, or mini-budget, to the House of Commons.
But today we are publishing our growth plan.
Many of their proposed tax cuts were simply reversing planned tax increases.
So I can therefore confirm that next year's planned increase in corporation tax will be cancelled. The corporation tax rate will not rise to 25%.
What we wanted to do is, as soon as we got into government, send a big signal to business that Britain was open for business, that we weren't going to raise our corporation tax. We wanted to attract investment and get growth going.
But, Mr. Speaker, we will do more to encourage private investment.
They also thought the top tax rate, paid by the wealthy, was too high, at 45%.
But I'm not going to cut the additional rate of tax today, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to abolish it altogether. From April the 23rd, we will have a single higher rate of income tax of 40%.
And by the way, that tax raised absolutely no money. So the only reason we have a 45p tax rate in Britain is a kind of virtue signalling device to say we're being tough on high earners. It doesn't actually raise the country any money at all.
And then I thought, this will be incredibly costly. And where's the money going to come from?
People talk about unfunded tax cuts. but they don't talk about unfunded government programmes.
We promised a new approach for a new era. We promised to release the enormous potential of this country. Our growth plan has delivered all those promises and more, Mr. Speaker, and I commend it to the House.
The following Monday, the financial markets reacted. The pound fell against the dollar. Interest rates shot up, driving mortgage rates up. Bonds declined in value. Pension funds were hard hit.
The bond vigilantes came for the Tory government, which I think utterly surprised the free market Prime Minister. A free market Prime Minister didn't actually believe that the markets had any agency.
Over the course of a Friday to Sunday, the pronouncements coming from the Chancellor and the Prime Minister essentially destroyed confidence in the financial management of the United Kingdom, and that's where all the responsibility lies.
Could simply proposing a budget do all this? Part of the answer lies in an exotic financial instrument called LDIs, liability-driven investments. UK pension funds had heavily invested in LDIs. Why? Pension fund managers were encouraged by the Bank of England and regulators, the so-called Blob, to invest in government bonds, called gilts. But due to low interest rates, the gilts were not generating enough income to pay out full pension benefits. So the Bank of England and the regulators encouraged the pension fund managers to invest in LDI funds. The LDI fund manager, using the gilts as collateral, buys more gilts. He does this several times, further leveraging his investment. It all works fine, unless interest rates rise. Then the value of the gilts would decline. Since the fund manager borrowed against them as collateral, this could trigger a margin call, forcing him to sell the gilts for cash. The whole house of cards could collapse. Something like this happened in the US when the Silicon Valley Bank went bust.
The week after the money budget was the very week that the Fed was aggressively raising rates, and that caught a lot of people off.
You have this situation where the markets are already a little on edge, and then when this budget plan comes out, that caused a little spike in interest rates, which would have been perfectly fine, except you have lurking out there this financial architecture that is particularly vulnerable and particularly vulnerable to falling into a negative feedback loop.
The Bank of England's very lucky that its incompetence was overshadowed by the sort of straw that broke the camel's back effect of the mini-budget.
The party conference was a hothouse of all of the problems, all of the issues in the Conservative Party all being brought to one location. Party activists were encouraging me to keep on with the policies, were very supportive, but there was a lot of backbiting from Conservative MPs and deliberate attempts to undermine my policies.
There was rumblings in the party. There was a lot of pressure from party colleagues to remove the 45p rate. There was a narrative building that we were essentially just looking after rich people, as opposed to trying to incentivize the entrepreneurs and wealth creators.
I feared that we would lose a vote in Parliament on it. So you then work from the logic of, if we're going to lose a vote in Parliament on this policy, it's better to U-turn now.
Thank you. Thank you.
Liz Truss delivered the keynote address.
The fact is that the abolition of the 45p tax rate became a distraction from the major parts of our growth plan. That is why we're no longer proceeding with it. I get it, and I have listened.
The disastrous mistake, to my mind, was made of a U-turn, and a U-turn on something that didn't matter financially. And from that point on, I think everything unravelled. It showed that the government was fundamentally weak.
Liz Truss excoriated her enemies, to the delight of the party faithful.
I will not allow the anti-growth coalition to hold us back. They taxi from North London townhouses to the BBC studio to dismiss anyone challenging the status quo. From broadcast to podcast, they peddle the same old answers. It's always more taxes, more regulation, and more meddling. Wrong, wrong, wrong.
Andrew Bailey, head of the Bank of England, stepped in to help the hard-hit pension funds.
Essentially, they had to be bailed out. They needed a liquidity, a line of liquidity provided for by the bank, which would essentially buy those assets off them to make them whole as they were suffering losses when the interest rates were going up.
But there was a catch. The Blob was fighting back.
The Bank of England would provide support for 14 days. Of course, that created a cliff edge for the government, because after that 14 days was then a question of what would happen. So what the Bank of England did is, rather than taking responsibility for sorting out the problem, they made short-term interventions that actually created a talking point around a 2-week deadline.
You know, the Bank of England ultimately can't buck the markets on a permanent basis, and the support that they were providing and the intervention they were making had to be time limited.
And they consistently refused to extend the window.
You've got 3 days left now. You've got to get this done. Because again, part of the essence, I think, of a financial stability intervention is that it is clearly temporary.
And if you're being, somewhat sort of skeptic-minded, you might suggest that that was essentially very destabilizing for the Truss administration.
Then more trouble for the Truss team came from another independent agency, the Office of Budget Responsibility, the OBR, which does economic forecasting. The OBR report found that the Truss-Kwarteng mini-budget would cause a £70 billion hole, or deficit. And the report was leaked.
The OBR report becomes this enormous asteroid that is saying, hang on a sec, these numbers don't add up at all, and we have this enormous fiscal hole where we're going to be borrowing so much more than we've ever had to borrow before.
And ultimately, what I was told was that if we didn't reverse the corporation tax cuts, we would not be able to fund government gilts. What do I mean by that? I mean that the government wouldn't be able to fund its debt, and there would be an economic crisis in Britain. And at heart, I'm a patriot. I wasn't prepared to play a game of chicken with the British economy.
It's very interesting how sentiment plays out in politics. We'd spent $400 billion bailing people out of COVID, and nobody batted an eyelid. Suddenly, it's £72 billion, and that's the end of the world. But it's £72 billion out of a $2.5 trillion economy. It's an important amount, but it's not an amount that is the difference between solvency and bankruptcy.
Why couldn't they say that and then just push on?
It's a very good question. But I don't know. I don't know why we didn't just push on in that way. That seems to me to have been the obvious thing to do.
Now, this number has since proved to be completely wrong. In fact, the OBR has been found to be out by 500 billion over the course of its forecasting period. So this number was not true. So because of wrong numbers being leaked by the OBR, we were forced into U-turning on our entire plans. We were effectively scuppered by a combination of the Bank of England and the Office of Budget Responsibility.
Kwasi Kwarteng flew back from Washington, D.C. amidst rumors of his being fired.
I was summoned back on Thursday, so I took the flight on Friday. And I landed at Heathrow on Friday morning, October the 14th. And I was driven, I think, in a convoy to Downing Street.
Then what was the meeting with Liz like?
I think it was difficult for her. It was very emotional. She was crying when she sacked me, essentially. I was dry-eyed. I was very confused because I didn't see how it was going to end well. I really couldn't see that.
He has said that it was an emotional scene.
Yes, yes, it was. But it was emotional because what we had wanted to do was over.
And he said he warned you that they would come after you next.
Yeah, I knew that. I mean, he didn't need to tell me that, so I was quite aware of that.
Liz Truss appointed a new Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, who reflected the views of the Treasury orthodoxy she had lately opposed.
So you brought Jeremy Hunt in, and he did reverse everything.
Yes, but I brought him in to reverse everything. Essentially, a gun was pointed at my head.
Called the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Chancellor.
We've decided on the following changes to support confidence and stability. The Prime Minister and I agreed yesterday to reverse almost all the tax measures announced in the growth plan 3 weeks ago that have not been...
It's a horrible thing, I think, for a politician. Usually if your policies are working, you're voted out. But to have to oversee the reversal of your policies seems a particularly hard kind of torture.
Yes. It's like presiding at your own funeral.
What she seemed to be deciding when she hired Jeremy Hunt was that the experiment was over. The only viable way for any Conservative to be Prime Minister was to bow to this political and policy orthodoxy that she had campaigned against in that leadership election, 3 or 4 months before.
The OBR is now very much back in the picture. I can tell you that I spoke to Jeremy Hunt, the new Chancellor, yesterday, and I can tell you that it was a very clear and immediate meeting of minds between us about the importance of fiscal sustainability.
You did start having the sensation that the Blob was winning.
Mr. Speaker, those spending cuts are on the table for one reason and one reason only, because they crashed the economy. And working people are going to have to pay 500 quid more a month on their mortgages. And what's the Prime Minister's response? To say she's sorry. What does she think people will think and say? That's all right, I don't mind financial ruin. At least she apologised.
Prime Minister.
I do think there has to be some reflection of economic reality from the party opposite. Interest rates are rising across the world, and the economic conditions have worsened. And we are being honest. We're levelling with the public.
Mr. Speaker, the only mandate she's ever had is from members opposite. It was a mandate built on fantasy economics, and it ended in disaster. I've got the list here. 45p tax cut, gone. Corporation tax cut, gone. Economic credibility, gone. And her supposed best friend, the former Chancellor, he's gone as well. They're all gone. So why is she still here?
Mr. Speaker, I am a fighter and not a quitter. I have acted in the national interest to make sure that we have economic stability.
Prime Minister. Order. Order.
Liz Truss shifted her attention to another area, the high cost of energy.
What I wanted to do is fix the supply problem by getting fracking. We know the impact in the US of fracking has been to make the US a net energy exporter, and that was my ambition for Britain, for us to become a net energy exporter and to use our natural resources. Now, we faced a huge backlash on fracking, including from Conservative MPs.
There's quite a lot of local opposition to any proposal for fracking anywhere. We are a much more densely populated country than most of the United States, and so it was an unpopular policy, but she wanted to do it.
In spite of opposition from many of her own Conservative MPs, Liz Truss proposed to lift the ban on fracking. Not to start fracking, but to lift the ban.
The question is, as on the order paper, and I now call Jacob Rees-Mogg to move the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and may I thank the right honourable gentleman for raising this important topic. I recognise that many members and their constituents have concerns about shale gas. Well, that was a motion that I was speaking on. It was in my departmental area of responsibility. Throughout the day, everyone had been told it was a confidence vote. And a confidence vote determines whether you go to a general election or not. It is important.
But the motion before us is not about fracking. It's about confidence in this government. It is about who runs the country. The elected party, the Conservatives, or Labour, who lost the general election. This, unfortunately, is a cynical attempt by Labour to play party political games. It is a dastardly cynical move to create division, to weaponise this issue.
About half an hour before the debate ended, a relatively junior person in Downing Street sent a message to the Minister at the dispatch box to say this is not a confidence vote, which just created chaos.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. I really do need to press him on this issue of a confidence vote, so could he please confirm whether that is the case or not?
I thank the honourable...
We have to hear the answer. Minister.
I thank the honourable lady for that question, and that is a matter for party managers, and I'm not a party manager. Madam
But that was a decision that seemed to be made by Liz Truss without consulting the chief whip.
Party managers, the whips, are supposed to guide the debate and the voting, which happens in lobbies off the floor.
There's then reports of huge rows between the Prime Minister and the Chief Whip, people bursting into tears, people sort of storming off, swearing in the lobbies where everybody is voting. Nobody quite knows what's going on.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I would urge you to launch an investigation into the scenes outside the entrance to the No lobby earlier. I saw members being physically manhandled into another lobby and being bullied. If we want to stand up against bullying in this House of our staff, we have to stop bullying in this chamber as well, don't we?
Order. We're talking about behaviour. We will have a little bit of good behaviour for a moment on both sides of the House.
Were MPs actually physically pushed and pulled, or is that just a rumor?
No, a very silly MP made an allegation of this, which was looked into, and it was completely untrue. I was accused by him, silly man, of manhandling people without touching them.
That's an interesting skill.
It's an interesting concept, isn't it? As I am physically a weed, I've always realised that for me to manhandle people is unwise.
It did take on kind of an absurd quality the more it went on. It did start to feel like the gang who just couldn't shoot straight, and the public was picking up on that.
We won the vote with a majority of 100. It was an extremely good result in terms of the House of Commons that destroyed Liz Truss because there was this absurd and infuriating confusion.
I think after the fracking vote debacle, I walked around Parliament at the end of the day and just thought, this is over.
One day after the fracking vote, Liz Truss addressed the nation.
I cannot deliver the mandate on which I was elected by the Conservative Party. I have therefore spoken to His Majesty the King to notify him that I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party.
The next Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, would start 5 days later, making Liz Truss's full term 49 days.
Well, after that day, where things were clearly my authority had been severely damaged, my husband said to me, why are you continuing in this job? Do you really want to be Prime Minister if you can't actually do what you came into politics to do? And I don't like to, I often listen to people and then sort of think about it a bit. And I thought about it and I thought, no, I don't want to do that. I never wanted to be Prime Minister to be Prime Minister and sit in the chair and go to the meetings. I wanted to be Prime Minister to change things, and it was clear that there was not the will in the Conservative Parliamentary Party to do that, and therefore that is why I resigned.
It was all about her psychology, because technically, once she was the leader of the party, you could only have a vote of no confidence after a year. So technically, she wasn't going to be challenged. Now, people would have made rumblings, but there was no actual mechanism to remove her from office if she didn't want to go. And she, I think, saw the writing on the wall. She felt very uncomfortable in that situation. But somebody more bloody-minded, perhaps a Boris Johnson or somebody else, would have lasted longer simply because they would have refused for longer to resign.
I think too much was tried at once and too quickly. And of course, in politics, luck is very important. And luck was not with Liz Truss.
The mistake that they made was thinking about this problem purely in economic terms and thinking that if they came up with the right kind of economic solution to Britain's problems, it would be self-explanatory to voters. And that turned out not to be true. You have to explain and persuade.
Liz Truss clearly made political mistakes, as she herself has acknowledged. Are those mistakes sufficient to explain her precipitous downfall? Or was she, in part, done in by the Blob?
They were in a more powerful position than I was. I mean, ultimately, what this has shown is that the Bank of England governor is a lot less sackable than the Prime Minister.
Indeed, not a democratic outcome.
It wasn't a democratic outcome. And I don't believe it was an outcome that was in the interest of the people of Britain. We need to change the system, not just in the United Kingdom, but right across the West, because I see similar tendencies in the United States. There's so much power now held that isn't held by democratically elected politicians that we need. I've described this as a bigger bazooka, but we need a bigger bazooka to take on that level of consensus and groupthink, and we simply didn't have it.
What finally defeated Liz Truss, and so quickly? Did she single-handedly crash the economy? Was she done in by backstabbing allies? Was it her own political blunders and weaknesses? Or was it the Blob and the missing bigger bazooka? Liz Truss's 44 days in power is a cautionary tale in so many ways.